The heat on the long-range sniper course was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed down on the shoulders of the men lying prone in the dirt, blurring the air with shimmering waves of mirage that made the distant steel targets look like they were dancing underwater. And amidst the high-tech cacophony of ballistics computers, laser rangefinders, and the rhythmic, bone-rattling thud of heavy-caliber rifles, an old man in a faded red work shirt moved with the slow, shuffling gait of someone who had long ago ceased to be in a hurry. He was the range custodian, a job that mostly involved emptying trash barrels, replacing cardboard backers on the target frames during cold intervals, and sweeping up the glittering carpet of spent brass casings that littered the concrete firing line and to the 24 candidates of the advanced sniper course. The elite of the elite, young men with perfect vision, steady nerves, and the arrogance that comes from being the best in their units. He was nothing more than background noise, a relic in worn blue jeans and scuffed boots who was tolerated but never truly seen. They didn't know his name. They didn't know why his hands trembled with a constant, rhythmic shake that made the simple act of picking up a soda can look like a struggle. And they certainly didn't know that the eyes hidden beneath the brim of his greasy, unbranded baseball cap were scanning the tree line with a level of predatory calculation that would have terrified them if they had the wisdom to recognize it. The morning sun beat down on the back of his neck, burning skin that had been leathered by decades of exposure to elements far harsher than this training ground. And as he bent down to retrieve a handful of .338 Lapua Magnum casings near the position of the lead squad, his hand shook violently, the brass rattling against his fingers before he finally managed to drop it into his canvas sack. A suppressed snicker rippled through the group of candidates lying nearby, young men with high-end tight haircuts and thousands of dollars of personalized gear strapped to their chests. And one of them, a corporal named Miller who had been top of the leaderboard all week, nudged his spotter and whispered loud enough for the old man to hear, asking if the range had installed a vibrating alarm or if it was just the janitor trying to pick up a penny. Keep listening, and which city are you listening from? And if you enjoy the story, please subscribe for more. The laughter that followed was short, sharp, and cruel, the kind of dismissive humor that young warriors used to distance themselves from weakness, because in their world, a tremor was a death sentence, a sign of frailty that had no place behind the trigger of a precision weapon system, and they watched the old man with a mixture of pity and disdain, seeing only the shaking hands and the slow movements, completely missing the fact that his feet made absolutely no sound on the gravel as he moved away. The old man heard them. Of course he heard them. His hearing was the only thing that hadn't faded with age, tuned by years of listening for the snap of a twig or the slide of a bolt in a silent jungle. But he didn't react, didn't turn, didn't scowl, just continued his work with a stoic patience that seemed to irritate Miller even more. Miller was the prototype of the modern sniper, a technological marvel who trusted his Kestrel weather meter and his ballistic calculator more than he trusted his own senses, and he was currently sweating over a shot that had baffled half the class. A cold-bore engagement at 1,400 meters, across a valley known for its deceptive, swirling winds that could push a bullet 3 feet off target without barely rustling the leaves on the trees. The instructor, a grizzled master sergeant named Vance, who stood back in the shade of the tower with his arms crossed, had been watching the class fail this specific shot for an hour, his face a mask of disappointment. And now it was Miller's turn to prove that his high scores on the paper targets meant something in the real world. Miller adjusted the turrets on his rifle, the clicks audible in the tense silence, and glanced at his spotter, a younger private who was squinting through a spotting scope and reading off wind speeds from a digital gauge, calling out a full-value wind from the left at 4 miles per hour. The old man, who had paused near the trash drum a few feet behind them, stopped sweeping for a moment and lifted his head, the brim of his cap tilting just enough to reveal eyes the color of cold slate, and he looked not at the flag on the range, nor at the digital meter in the spotter's hand, but at the tall grass rippling near the edge of the valley floor, miles away, and then at the flight pattern of a hawk circling a thermal updraft near the target area. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut like a stone, that the digital reading was wrong, that the wind downrange was doing something the sensors couldn't feel, a fishtail effect that would slap the bullet down and to the right if the shooter didn't hold for it. It was an instinct born of 10,000 hours behind glass, of lying in mud and snow until he became part of the earth. But when he cleared his throat softly, a sound like dry leaves crinkling, and took a half step toward Miller, the reaction was immediate and hostile. Miller spun around, his focus broken, and glared at the old man, asking what he wanted, his tone dripping with the irritation of a professional interrupted by an amateur. The old man hesitated, his hand shaking as he pointed a gnarled finger toward the valley, his voice raspy and unused, suggesting quietly that the wind was lying, that there was a downdraft coming off the ridge that wouldn't show on the meter, and that if he held left, he was going to miss. Miller stared at him, blinking in disbelief, and then looked at the old man's trembling hand, the finger vibrating in the air, and a cruel smile spread across his face as he asked the rest of the squad if they were really getting shooting advice from a guy who looked like he couldn't hold a spoon steady, let alone a rifle. The spotter laughed, shaking his head, and told the old man to stick to the broom and let the shooters do the shooting, because this was a precision course, not a retirement home bingo night. The insult hung in the hot, stagnant air, heavy and ugly, but the old man just lowered his hand, the tremor still visible, and nodded once, a slow, sad acknowledgement of their arrogance before stepping back into the shadows of the overhang. He didn't argue, didn't pull rank. He had none here, just a contractor badge clipped to his belt, and didn't try to explain that the shaking in his hands was a souvenir from a nervous system overload during a 3-day extraction in a place that didn't exist on any map. A permanent reminder of the adrenaline that had once kept him alive when everyone else was dead. He just watched, his face impassive, as Miller turned back to his rifle, shook off the distraction, and settled his cheek against the stock, exhaling a long breath as he prepared to send a match-grade round across the valley. The master sergeant in the tower watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, his gaze flicking from the arrogant young corporal to the silent old man in the red shirt. And for a second, it looked like he might say something, might intervene, but he stayed silent, perhaps wanting to see if the kid would learn the lesson the hard way, or perhaps because even he didn't realize who the old man really was. The range went silent, the kind of heavy, pressurized silence that precedes violence, and Miller squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, the muzzle brake kicking up a cloud of dust, and the squad waited for the metallic clang of a hit, counting the seconds of flight time, 1, 2, 3, but the sound never came. Instead, the spotter cursed softly, reporting a splash in the dirt, low and right, exactly where the old man had said the wind would push it. Miller sat up, ripping his Velcro patch off his sleeve in frustration, blaming the ammunition, blaming the barrel heat, blaming the spotter for a bad read, anything but his own inability to read the air. The old man didn't smile, didn't say, "I told you so." He just reached down to pick up another piece of brass, his hand shaking rhythmically, and moved a few feet closer, his presence now an irritation that Miller couldn't shake. "Hey, old-timer," Miller snapped, turning around again, his face red with the embarrassment of missing in front of the entire platoon. "Do you mind? You're distracting me. Go shake somewhere else." The cruelty of the remark was stunning, even for a military environment where thick skin was a requirement, and a few of the other candidates looked down, uncomfortable, but no one spoke up, no one told Miller to stand down because Miller was the alpha, the best shot, the leader, and the old man was just nothing. A janitor, a failure of biology. The old man stopped, his back to them, and for a moment his shoulders stiffened, the muscles beneath the faded red fabric tensing, as if he were physically restraining himself from turning around and doing something that would end his employment and possibly Miller's career. But he simply exhaled, the tension flowing out of him, and continued his slow shuffle down the line. But the dynamic had shifted. The air was charged now, the failure of the lead shooter hanging over the group like a storm cloud, and the young men were looking for a scapegoat, a target for their frustration. Miller, determined to prove that the miss was a fluke, racked the bolt and chambered another round, his movements aggressive and jerky, losing the fluid calm that marks a true marksman. He demanded a new wind read, aggressive and loud, and his spotter, rattled by the outburst, fumbled with the kestrel, calling out numbers that were jumping all over the place. "It's the heat," the spotter stammered. "The sensors are getting weird readings." The old man, who was now standing near the ammo crate, spoke again, his voice barely a whisper but cutting through the noise of the wind. "It's not the heat," he said, not looking at them, looking at the trees. "It's the valley. It breathes. You have to wait for the exhale." Miller slammed his hand on the shooting mat. "Who asked you?" he shouted, standing up this time, looming over the smaller, frailer man. "You think because you sweep the brass you know how to send it. Look at your hands, old man. You're vibrating like a leaf. You couldn't hit the broad side of a barn from the inside. Stop giving advice to professionals." The insult about the hands was the line in the sand, the point where disrespect morphed into cruelty, and the old man finally turned to face him fully. His face was lined with deep crevices, rivers of age and experience that ran through a landscape of sun-damaged skin and white stubble, but his eyes were clear, terrifyingly clear. He looked at Miller's hands, steady, strong, youthful, and then at his own trembling fingers. "Steadiness isn't in the hands, son," the old man said softly. "It's in the mind, and right now your mind is louder than a jet engine." Miller laughed, a harsh barking sound. "My mind is fine, my shooting is fine. You're the one who needs to check out. Why are you even here, just to annoy us?" The other snipers were gathering around now, a circle of judgment feeding off the conflict. They saw an old man who had overstepped, a civilian who didn't know his place, and they were eager to see Miller put him back in his box. "I'm here," the old man said, "because someone has to clean up after you boys." It was a double meaning, sharp and subtle, implying that he wasn't just cleaning up their brass, but their mistakes, their arrogance, their lack of respect for the craft. Miller didn't catch the nuance, he only heard the backtalk. "Well, go clean somewhere else," Miller sneered. "Unless you want to get down here and show us how it's done. Maybe we can prop your rifle on a sandbag and tape your hands to the stock so you don't rattle the scope loose." The challenge was thrown, a rhetorical absurdity meant to humiliate, but the old man didn't look away. He looked at the rifle lying on the mat, a customized, suppressed long-range system that cost more than the old man made in a year, and then back at Miller. "I don't need tape," the old man said, and the quiet confidence in his voice sent a strange chill through the group, a sudden drop in temperature despite the midday sun. "And I don't shoot for fun." Miller rolled his eyes, turning to the group. "You hear this? Grandpa thinks he's a shooter. Okay, tell you what, since you know so much about the wind and the valley breathing and whatever other senile nonsense you're spouting, why don't you take the shot? If you hit it, I'll clean the latrines for a week. If you miss, which you will, probably by a mile, you leave the range and don't come back until we're graduated." It was a bet made in anger, a bully's tactic to drive the old man away, but the stakes were suddenly real. The master sergeant in the tower leaned forward, his interest piqued, and he keyed his radio but didn't speak, watching. The old man looked at the rifle, then at the target 1,400 meters away, a steel plate the size of a man's chest, invisible to the naked eye, and then at his own shaking hands. He knew what they saw. They saw a broken old laborer. They didn't see the man who had once spent 4 days motionless in a rice paddy with a bullet in his leg, waiting for a general to step out onto a balcony. They didn't see the man whose name was redacted from the files that these young men studied in history class. He looked at Miller, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips, sad and weary. "I don't want you cleaning latrines," the old man said. "I just want you to learn to listen." Miller scoffed. "Put up or shut up, old man." The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes the skin prickle. The young snipers smirked, expecting the old man to back down, to mutter an excuse and shuffle away, defeated by his own frailty. But he didn't. The old man slowly bent down, his knees popping audibly in the silence, and placed his canvas sack of brass on the ground. He wiped his trembling hands on his jeans, leaving faint streaks of grease on the denim, and then, with a slowness that felt agonizing to the watching soldiers, he stepped onto the shooting mat. The mockery stopped instantly, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. He was actually going to do it. He was going to try. And as he lowered his frail body into the prone position behind the massive rifle, his hands shaking so badly that he struggled to adjust the bipod, the young men exchanged glances of disbelief and anticipation, ready to laugh when the scope wobble made him seasick, ready to jeer when the shot went wild. But they had no idea that the moment his cheek touched the stock, the world was about to change. The act of lowering himself to the shooting mat was not a fluid motion for the old man, but rather a series of negotiated settlements between his mind and his calcified joints, a painful, creaking descent that was agonizingly slow and watched by every pair of eyes on the firing line with a mixture of amusement and impatience. To the young soldiers standing in the harsh, bleached sunlight, this wasn't just an old man getting prone. It was a spectacle of decay, a confirmation of their own superiority, and as his knees hit the gravel before finding the padded edge of the mat, a sound like dry branches snapping underfoot seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the range. Corporal Miller stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his biceps bulging against the fabric of his combat shirt. A look of exaggerated incredulity plastered across his face as he played to his audience, shaking his head and muttering to the private beside him that they should probably call the medic now just to save time, because getting back up was going to be a lot harder than getting down. The old man ignored the commentary, just as he had ignored the heat and the years of invisibility, focusing entirely on the rifle that lay before him like a sleeping beast. A suppressed .338 Lapua Magnum, a weapon of terrifying precision and power, painted in a desert digital camouflage pattern that seemed alien against his faded, grease-stained work shirt. His hands, those treacherous, trembling appendages that had betrayed him 1,000 times in the cafeteria line or while signing paperwork, were now the center of attention, vibrating with a palsy that seemed to intensify as he reached out to touch the pistol grip. The shake was violent, a rapid, rhythmic oscillation that made his fingers look like blurred wings, and when he finally made contact with the polymer stock, the vibration transferred to the weapon itself, causing the bipod legs to jitter slightly against the concrete. A microscopic dance that, at 1,400 meters, would translate to a mismeasured in football fields. Laughter rippled through the squad again, louder this time, less suppressed, fueled by the sheer absurdity of the visual. A janitor who looked like he was suffering from the early stages of Parkinson's trying to command a weapon system designed to take heads off at a mile. "Check your seismograph," one of the privates snickered, earning a high five from his spotter. "We got an earthquake on the firing line." Miller stepped closer, his shadow falling over the old man, blocking the sun but offering no relief from the heat of his scorn. "Hey, Pops," Miller said, his voice dripping with false concern, "careful with that trigger. That's a 2-pound pull. You sneeze or twitch or just vibrate too hard and you're gonna send a round into the next county. Maybe we should get you a sandbag for your whole body." The old man didn't look up. He was busy with the scope, his eye pressing against the rubber cup, but even that simple act was a struggle. His head bobbed slightly with the tremors of his neck muscles, and he had to fight to find the exit pupil, the tiny tunnel of light that would show him the world downrange. Inside the optic, the image was a chaotic mess, the crosshairs dancing wildly across the target area, slashing back and forth over the brown grass and the gray steel, a dizzying display of instability that would have made a novice shooter vomit from motion sickness. To anyone watching the external struggle, it looked hopeless, a sad display of senility, but inside the old man's mind, a different process was beginning, a slow, grinding shift of gears that hadn't been engaged in decades. He was assessing the rifle, not as a piece of technology, but as an extension of his own broken geometry. The length of pull was too short for his lanky frame, the cheek riser was set too high for his sunken facial structure, and the scope's parallax was dialed for a younger man's eyes, but he didn't complain, didn't ask for tools to adjust it. He simply improvised, shifting his body angle, canting his hips to load the bipod with a different kind of pressure, using the weight of his own bones, the only things that didn't shake, to anchor the weapon. But the shaking hands remained the focal point of the ridicule. As he reached up to adjust the elevation turret, his fingers fumbled, slipping off the dial twice before he managed to grip it, the clicks audible in the silence, click, 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 painfully slow, lacking the crisp, authoritative snap of a professional adjustment. "Jesus," Miller groaned, looking at his watch, an expensive tactical piece that probably cost more than the old man's truck. "We're aging in real time here. By the time he takes the shot, the war will be over. Sarge, are we really doing this? This is a liability. If he negligently discharges into the berm, it's on you." Master Sergeant Vance, still standing in the shade of the tower, didn't move his arms from his chest, his eyes hidden behind dark ballistic eyewear. "The range is hot, Corporal," Vance said, his voice flat, giving nothing away. "You issued the challenge. Let him shoot." It was a dismissal, but also a test, though whether it was a test for the old man or for Miller was unclear. Miller huffed, annoyed that his authority was being undermined by the instructor's passivity, and turned his aggression back to the prone figure. "You hear that? You got the green light to embarrass yourself. But I'm telling you now, if you strip the gears on that scope because you're shaking like a washing machine, you're paying for it." The old man finally spoke, his voice muffled by the position, his lips barely moving against the stock. "Spotter," he rasped. "I need a spotter." The request hung in the air, audacious and desperate. A sniper never shoots alone, not at this distance, not unless he has no choice, and the old man knew he couldn't track the trace of the bullet and the target impact simultaneously with his vision blurring from the recoil he knew was coming. He needed eyes. Miller laughed, a harsh barking sound. "A spotter! You want one of us to get down in the dirt with you and validate this farce? No way! You're on your own, space cowboy. Use the force." The cruelty was absolute now, a wall of isolation. They weren't just betting against him. They were actively rooting for his humiliation, wanting him to fail so spectacularly that he would disappear back into the janitor's closet and never challenge their reality again. But then, unexpectedly, the young private who had been Miller's spotter, a kid named Henderson, who had laughed earlier but looked increasingly uncomfortable with the level of bullying, hesitated. He looked at Miller, then at the old man's frail, shaking back, and something in his conscience, or perhaps just a morbid curiosity to see the disaster up close, made him move. "I'll do it," Henderson muttered, stepping forward before Miller could stop him. "I'm already set up." Miller glared at him, a betrayal in the ranks. "Don't encourage him, Henderson. You're wasting your time." Henderson ignored the corporal, kneeling down behind his spotting scope, though he didn't lie prone, maintaining a physical distance that said, "I'm watching, but I'm not with him." "All right, old-timer," Henderson said, his voice tight. "I'm on glass, but I'm not doing the math for you. You call your hold. I just watch the splash." The old man nodded imperceptibly, the movement lost in the constant tremors of his head. "Fair enough," he whispered. He closed his eyes for a second, a long blink that looked like fatigue but was actually a reboot, a flushing of the visual cortex. When he opened them, he didn't look at the crosshair. He looked at the world. The heat was intensifying, the mirage boiling up from the valley floor like clear oil on a skillet, distorting the image, making the target appear to float and shimmy. The wind was the real enemy, though. It was a phantom. The flags on the firing line were limp, hanging dead against the poles, suggesting zero wind. The mid-range flags at 600 meters were lazily drifting left to right, but at the target, way out at the edge of the tree line, the tall grass was doing something strange. It was flattening, bowing down in sporadic pulses that didn't match the flags. The breath of the valley. A downdraft caused by the cooling air in the shadowed crevices of the distant ridgeline, colliding with the rising heat of the basin. It would push the bullet down and weirdly to the left, a vector that no ballistic computer could predict without manual input. The old man's hand shook as he reached for the windage turret, but then he stopped. He didn't dial. He was going to hold it. "Holding," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Holding 3 mils left, adding 2 minutes elevation." Henderson, watching through the spotting scope, scoffed audibly. 3 mils left? Dude, the flags are dead. You hold 3 mils left, you're gonna hit the tree line. You're shooting at ghosts." Miller, hearing the call, threw his head back and laughed. 3 mils, you hear that? He's aiming at a different zip code. This is gonna be good. He's literally blind. The old man didn't correct them. He didn't explain that the flags were lying, that the flags were measuring the air where the bullet was fast, but the bullet would be slow, tired, and vulnerable by the time it reached the valley floor, where the invisible wind waited to slap it down. He just breathed, and this was where the escalation truly began, the waiting. The old man didn't shoot. He lay there, his body vibrating, the rifle barrel making tiny, nauseating circles in the air, and he waited. Seconds ticked by. Sweat dripped from Miller's nose. The other students shifted their weight, their boots crunching in the gravel. "Shoot the damn gun," someone shouted from the back. "Today, Grandpa," Miller kicked the edge of the shooting mat, a burst of aggression. "Come on, you're wasting range time. Pull the trigger or get up." But the old man was trapped in a timeline they couldn't see. He was waiting for the hawk. The same hawk he had watched earlier was circling back, drifting lower, and he watched its wings. The bird suddenly dipped, its right wing tucking as it hit a pocket of sinking air. There, the exhale, the valley was breathing out. The turbulence was settling into a laminar flow for a window of maybe 4 seconds. The old man's finger, gnarled and trembling, moved to the trigger guard. The shaking in his hand was terrible to behold. His index finger was bouncing against the metal guard like a moth trapped in a lantern. How could he possibly squeeze smoothly? It was physically impossible. He was going to jerk the trigger. He was going to slap it. The physics of his own body were his enemy. Miller saw the finger twitching and leaned in, sneering. "Look at that trigger control. You're gonna negligent discharge before you even get on target. Give it up." The master sergeant took a step forward, the first real sign of concern. He saw the severity of the tremor and realized this might actually be dangerous. If the old man jerked the rifle sideways during the shot, the recoil could break his collarbone or send the round skipping over the berm. "Sir," Vance called out, his voice cutting through the mockery, "if you are not stable, stand down. That is a direct order. We do not fire unsafe." It was the out the old man could have taken. He could have stood up, claimed his nerves were shot, and walked away with some shred of dignity, blaming his age. The students expected it. They wanted it. But the old man didn't stand down. He did the opposite. He stopped breathing. He initiated a respiratory pause, emptying his lungs completely, forcing his body into a state of temporary hypoxia. It was a dangerous trick for a man his age, starving the brain of oxygen to slow the heart rate, but it was the only way to dampen the tremors. As the oxygen levels in his blood dropped, his vision tunneled, the peripheral world turning gray, the mocking faces of Miller and the others fading into a dull buzz. The only thing that remained was the reticle and the target, and then the miracle that wasn't a miracle but a mastery of physiology. The shaking changed. It didn't stop, not entirely, but it synchronized. The violent, chaotic rattle smoothed out into a rhythmic, predictable sway. The crosshair wasn't jumping anymore, it was floating. A figure-8 pattern, infinite, smooth, repeating. He wasn't fighting the shake, he was riding it. He was timing the trigger brake to the exact millisecond where the figure-8 crossed the center of the target. It was a technique known only to those who had been forced to shoot while wounded, while freezing, while dying. The dead man's drift. Henderson, watching through the scope, gasped softly. He's settling. Miller didn't believe it. He's passing out is what he's doing. Look at him, he's not breathing. Someone grab him. Miller reached down, his hand outstretched to grab the old man's shoulder and physically haul him off the rifle, convinced he was having a medical episode. "That's it, show's over," Miller shouted, his hand inches from the faded red fabric. The disrespect was total now, a physical violation of the shooter's space, the ultimate sin on a firing line. But before Miller's hand could make contact, before the master sergeant could shout the ceasefire command, the old man's finger, which had been hovering, vibrating, waiting, contracted. It wasn't a squeeze. It was a thought translated into action. The trigger broke. The rifle detonated. The sound was a thunderclap that slammed into the chests of the bystanders, the muzzle brake venting high-pressure gas to the sides, kicking up a massive cloud of dust that instantly obscured the old man and the weapon. The recoil wave rippled through the old man's frail body, visually punishing, his shoulder snapping back, his hat flying off his head to reveal a scalp scarred and pale. But he didn't flinch. He didn't close his eyes. He rode the recoil, cycling the bolt with a mechanical violence that seemed impossible for his shaking hands, ejecting the spent brass, which spun through the air, glinting in the sun, and landed ting at Miller's boots, and slamming a fresh round into the chamber before the dust had even settled. He was back on the scope in under a second. Miller recoiled from the blast, stumbling back, waving his hand to clear the dust. "You crazy old bat, you nearly blew my eardrums out. I told you to stop." The squad erupted in chaos, shouting, assuming the shot had gone wild, assuming he had just negligently discharged into the dirt. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" someone yelled. The master sergeant was moving now, running toward the mat, his face dark with anger. "Clear that weapon!" Vance roared. "Get him off the line!" The disrespect had peaked. They treated him like a dangerous child who had found a loaded gun. But amidst the shouting, the dust, and the anger, one sound cut through the noise, or rather the lack of it. Henderson, the spotter, he hadn't moved. He was frozen, his eye glued to the spotting scope, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream of disbelief. He wasn't looking at the old man. He was looking downrange. The flight time of a .338 Lapua at 1,400 meters is roughly 2.5 seconds. A lifetime. The bullet had left the barrel, climbed high into the sky, arcing over the valley floor, fighting the drag, spinning like a drill bit. It had encountered the dead air where the flags hung limp, and then it had dropped into the valley where the invisible breath of the earth waited to push it. And pushed it, it did. The wind slapped the bullet hard, shoving it down and left, exactly as the old man had predicted. If he had aimed at the center, he would have missed by feet, but he hadn't aimed at the center. He had aimed at the ghosts. The silence from Henderson was the only warning Miller got that something was wrong. Miller looked at the spotter, confused by his paralysis. "Henderson, Henderson, where did it go? Tell me he hit the berm." Henderson slowly lowered the spotting scope, his face pale, drained of blood. He looked up at Miller, then at the master sergeant who was reaching down to grab the old man's rifle. "Wait," Henderson whispered, his voice trembling more than the old man's hands ever had. "Wait," Miller stared at him. "Wait for what? He missed." "No," Henderson said, the word coming out as a strangled croak. "He didn't miss." The timing was cruel. The sound of the impact, the distinct metallic thwack of a bullet striking steel plate, finally traveled the 1,400 meters back to the firing line. It arrived late, like a message from the past. Clang! The sound was faint but unmistakable. A hit. A solid centermass hit. The firing line went dead silent. The shouting stopped. The master sergeant froze, his hand inches from the weapon. Miller's jaw went slack. The dust drifted away, revealing the old man who was still prone, still looking through the scope, his hand shaking violently again now that the respiratory pause was over. He didn't celebrate. He didn't look up. He just racked the bolt again, the sound distinct and terrifyingly professional in the hush. "Wind is switching," the old man rasped, his voice barely audible to the stunned men standing over him. "Coming from the right now, thermal flip." He wasn't done. He wasn't just taking one lucky shot. He was engaging the targets. And as Miller stood there, his arrogance shattering like glass, the realization began to creep in, cold and sharp, that the shaking hands weren't a sign of weakness. They were the rattle of a machine that was running too hot, a machine that had been built for war and had never been turned off. The old man inhaled again, the terrible, shuddering breath of a predator preparing to strike, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Miller wanted to speak, wanted to deny it, but the metallic echo of that first hit was still ringing in his ears, a bell that couldn't be unrung. The escalation was over, the reality was about to arrive. The metallic resonance of the first impact on the steel target seemed to hang in the shimmering air for an eternity. A lonely, defiant note that refused to fade, ringing in the ears of the assembled snipers like a church bell announcing a funeral for their collective arrogance. But before the shock could fully settle into their bones, before Corporal Miller could scramble for a rationalization to patch the gaping hole in his worldview, the old man was already moving again. The silence on the firing line was absolute, a vacuum where the only sound was the heavy, oiled clack-slide clack of the bolt being worked with a ferocity that belied the frailty of the hands manipulating it. The old man didn't look up to check his hit, didn't pause to relish the moment, didn't offer a smirk or a nod to the stunned audience. He simply lowered his head back to the stock, his cheek welding to the polymer with the familiarity of a man returning to a lover after a long war. Miller, his face flushed a mottled crimson that had nothing to do with the sun and everything to do with the sudden, violent inversion of his reality, stammered something incoherent, a desperate plea to the laws of probability, shouting that it was a fluke, a lucky flyer that had caught a rogue gust of wind, but the words died in his throat as the old man's finger curled around the trigger for the second time. The tremor was back, the violent shaking that had been the source of their mockery returning the moment the recoil energy dissipated, his hand vibrating against the pistol grip like a tuning fork. But just as before, as his lungs emptied and the world narrowed down to the tunnel of glass, the shaking transmuted into that hypnotic, rhythmic sway. Crack! The second shot tore through the atmosphere, the muzzle blast kicking up a fresh plume of dust that coated Miller's boots. And this time there was no waiting for the spotter, no hesitation from the audience. They all turned their heads in unison, like spectators at a tennis match, tracing the invisible arc of the bullet across the valley, their eyes straining against the glare, and when the sound returned, clang, it was louder, cleaner, a dead center impact on the head plate of the target, a target the size of a dinner plate at nearly a mile away. Henderson, still glued to the spotting scope, let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, whispering, "Impact," with a reverence usually reserved for religious experiences. "2 for 2, Henderson breathed, his voice trembling. He's walking it." Miller stepped back, looking at the master sergeant, waiting for Vance to intervene to stop this surreal display, to yell that the old man was violating safety protocols or wasting ammunition. But Vance was frozen, his arms uncrossed, his dark glasses removed to reveal eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and a dawning, terrifying recognition. Vance wasn't looking at the target. He was looking at the old man's trigger finger. He was watching the way the old man managed the reset, the way he didn't trap the trigger to the rear but allowed it to reset during the recoil impulse, a technique so old, so dangerous, and so difficult that it hadn't been taught in sniper schools since the frantic, desperate battles of the Central Highlands. The old man wasn't just shooting. He was conducting a symphony of violence, and the tempo was increasing. Clack, slide, clack. Boom! A third shot. This one at a different target, a silhouette tucked into the shadows of a rock formation 1,200 meters out, a cold target that hadn't been engaged all day, meaning the barrel data was different, the wind hold was different, the elevation was different. The old man didn't dial, he didn't touch the turrets. He was holding over, using the reticle's hash marks with a mental calculator that processed ballistics faster than the chip in Miller's PDA. Thwack! The sound of the hit came back almost instantly, a duller thud against the heavier steel. 3 hits, 3 different wind calls, 0 misses. The atmosphere on the range shifted from mockery to a heavy, suffocating dread. The young soldiers, the elite, the future of the Corps, realized with a sinking feeling in their guts that they were witnessing something that shouldn't be possible, something that violated the rules of their universe where youth, technology, and stability were the kings. Here was a man who looked like he couldn't open a jar of pickles, dismantling their entire curriculum with a borrowed rifle and a pair of shaking hands. Miller, stripped of his bravado, looked small, his expensive gear looking like a costume, his posture collapsing inward. "How?" Miller whispered, the word escaping him involuntarily. "He's shaking! Look at him, he's shaking apart." And he was. Between shots, the old man's body convulsed with the tremors, his head bobbing, his shoulders twitching, but the moment he engaged the weapon, he became stone. It was a terrifying dichotomy, a switch that flipped between frailty and lethality, and it was unnerving the students more than the accuracy itself. It was as if the rifle was the battery keeping him alive, the only thing that gave him purpose. But the scene was about to shift again, the private humiliation of a squad about to become a public spectacle of the highest order. From the access road behind the range tower, a low rumble announced the arrival of heavy vehicles. Not the usual transport trucks, but the distinct, aggressive growl of up-armored SUVs, a convoy moving with purpose. Dust swirled as 3 black government vehicles tore around the bend and screeched to a halt near the gravel parking area, their doors flying open before the wheels had fully stopped. The master sergeant snapped his head around, cursing under his breath. "The general!" Vance hissed. "The inspection tour. I thought they were at the pistol range." Panic flared in his eyes. A live-fire range with a civilian contractor shooting a student's weapon while the squad stood around watching was a career-ending safety violation waiting to be written up. "Cease fire!" Vance barked, his voice cracking with urgency. "Cease fire! Secure that weapon! Get him off the line now!" The command broke the spell. Miller, seeing a chance to redeem himself and regain control, lunged forward. "You heard him! Get up!" Miller shouted, reaching for the rifle barrel. "General's here! You're done!" But the old man didn't move. He didn't hear them. He was in the bubble, a psychological state where the auditory exclusion of combat filtered out everything except the wind and the target. He was tracking a hawk again, watching a thermal shift. He had 2 rounds left in the magazine. Miller grabbed the old man's shoulder roughly, his fingers digging into the thin fabric of the red shirt. "I said get up, you senile old!" Crack. The rifle fired again, the muzzle blast so close to Miller that he stumbled back, clutching his ears, shouting in pain and shock. The round went down range, true and straight, ignoring the chaos on the firing line. Clang, 4 hits, the audacity of it firing while being physically manhandled, stunned everyone into paralysis. Miller stood there, ears ringing, staring at the old man in horror. This wasn't a janitor. This was a machine that wouldn't stop until the cycle was complete. And then the voice of authority cut through the dust and the ringing ears, not the master sergeant's voice, but a voice that carried the weight of stars on a collar. "Who gave the order to cease fire?" The question was spoken calmly, but with a volume and projection that froze the blood of every man present. Standing at the edge of the concrete pad, surrounded by a phalanx of nervous aides and stern-faced MPs, was Lieutenant General Sterling, the Corps commander, a man known as the Iron Monk for his ascetic lifestyle and his ruthless standards of discipline. He was a giant of a man, even in his 60s, with a face carved from granite and eyes that missed nothing. He was staring not at the Master Sergeant, not at Miller, but at the prone figure in the red shirt. Master Sergeant Vance snapped to attention so hard his heels clicked, his face pale. "Sir, unsafe situation, sir. Civilian contractor on the gun. We were just removing him." General Sterling didn't blink. He walked past Vance, past the terrified students who were rigid at attention, and stepped onto the gravel, his boots crunching loudly in the sudden silence. He looked at the target line, then down at the old man who was now cycling the bolt for the final round, seemingly oblivious to the presence of one of the highest-ranking officers in the military. The general's aides moved to intercept, a major stepping forward with a hand raised to shout at the old man, but Sterling held up a single-gloved hand. "Hold," the general said softly. The major froze. "Sir, he's a civilian. He's violating range protocol." I said hold," Sterling repeated, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous. "Listen." The general tilted his head, listening not to the wind, but to the rhythm of the old man's breathing, the clack-slide-clack of the bolt, the way the vibration of his body transmitted into the ground. Sterling's eyes narrowed. He had heard this sound before, not on a training range, not in a movie. He had heard this specific cadence of fire, the rapid manipulation, the respiratory pause, the drift shooting decades ago in a valley where the air smelled of burning napalm and wet rot. He watched the old man's shaking hands. To the students, the tremors were a joke. To General Sterling, they were a fingerprint, a signature. The general's face, usually a mask of stoic command, softened into an expression of profound shock, his lips parting slightly. "It can't be," Sterling whispered to himself, the words barely audible over the wind. "He was dead. The report said he was dead." The old man fired the 5th and final shot. Boom! The report echoed off the canyon walls. The entire assembly held its breath, the general included. Clang! A perfect 5-round string. A group size of less than 5 inches at 1,400 meters. Impossible for a machine rest. Miraculous for a human. The bolt locked back on an empty chamber. The old man exhaled, a long, shuddering sound that seemed to deflate his entire body, and the shaking returned with a vengeance, his hands spasming as he released the grip. He didn't look back. He just laid his head on the shooting mat, exhausted like a battery drained of its last charge. Corporal Miller, seeing the general standing there, felt the need to explain, to distance himself from the disaster. "Sir," Miller squeaked, his voice cracking. "I tried to stop him. He's the janitor. He grabbed the weapon. He's crazy, sir. Look at him shaking." General Sterling slowly turned his head to look at Miller. The gaze was withering, stripping Miller of his rank, his pride, and his humanity in a single second. "Crazy?" Sterling asked, his voice quiet. "You think that was crazy?" Miller swallowed hard. "Sir, look at his hands. He has palsy. He's a hazard." Sterling looked back at the old man, who was struggling to push himself up from the prone position, his joints popping, his dignity returning to the invisible, shuffled state of a laborer. "Corporal," Sterling said, his voice loud enough for the entire platoon to hear. "Do you know why his hands shake?" Miller stammered. "No, sir, old age, alcohol." Sterling took a step closer to Miller, invading his personal space, radiating a terrifying intensity. "His hands shake," the general said, enunciating every word, "because of nerve damage sustained from carrying a sniper rifle for 72 consecutive hours without moving, while venomous centipedes bit his arms, waiting for a high-value target to step out of a bunker in a country we weren't supposed to be in. His hands shake because his nervous system was fried by an adrenaline dump that lasted for a week." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a tank. Miller's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The other students stared at the old man with wide, horrified eyes. The janitor was now sitting up, wiping the grease from his hands onto his jeans, looking tired and small. He finally noticed the general. The old man squinted against the sun, his blue eyes locking onto the stars on Sterling's collar. He didn't salute. He didn't stand to attention. He just offered a weary, crooked smile. "You got old, Jimmy," the old man rasped. The sound of a janitor calling a 3-star General Jimmy sent a shockwave through the group. The major gasped. Master Sergeant Vance looked like he was going to faint. "Sir," the major barked, "show some respect." General Sterling ignored the major entirely. He looked at the old man, his eyes glistening with a sudden, unbidden moisture. He looked at the faded red shirt, the worn boots, the face that time had tried to erase. "And you," Sterling said, his voice thick with emotion, "you got quiet. We looked for you for 10 years. The agency said you were KIA in the loss extraction." The old man shrugged, a simple gesture that dismissed a decade of mystery. "Better that way," he said. "Ghosts don't pay taxes." He started to stand, struggling with his bad knee. Before Miller or any of the young soldiers could move, General Sterling, the Iron Monk, the man who terrified the Joint Chiefs, dropped to one knee in the gravel. He didn't kneel to pray. He knelt to offer a hand. Reached out, his gloved hand grasping the trembling, grease-stained hand of the janitor. "Let me help you up, Gunny," the general whispered. The title Gunny hung in the air, but it felt insufficient. The way Sterling said it, it sounded like king. The old man took the hand, his grip surprisingly firm despite the tremors. As he stood, the wind blew his cap off again, revealing the scar that ran from his temple to behind his ear, a jagged, ugly line of white tissue. Sterling saw it and winced. "The mortar fragment?" Sterling asked. "Sniper," the old man corrected softly. "Bad wind call. He missed my brain by an inch. I didn't miss his." The casual violence of the statement, delivered in the tone of someone discussing the weather, made Miller's blood run cold. He realized, with a nausea rising in his throat, that he had just challenged a man who had killed more people than Miller had met. The general stood, brushing the dust from his knees, but he didn't release the old man's hand. He turned to the group of young snipers, who were now standing in a semicircle of shame and awe. Sterling's face hardened again into the mask of command. "You boys," Sterling said, looking at Miller, "think you're shooters because you can hit a plate with a computer doing the math. You think you're warriors because you have a patch on your shoulder." He gestured to the old man, who was now dusting off his red shirt, looking embarrassed by the attention. "You have no idea what a shooter is. You just watched a demonstration of the dead man's drift, a technique developed by this man when his unit was overrun and he was the only one left alive to hold the ridge." Sterling paused, letting the weight of the history sink in. "Master Sergeant Vance." "Sir," Vance barked. "Clear the range," Sterling ordered. "Cancel the training day. These men aren't ready to shoot. They need to learn how to see first." Vance nodded, pale. "Yes, sir. Pack it up." As the students scrambled to collect their gear, moving with the frantic energy of children trying to escape a scolding, Miller remained frozen. He couldn't look away from the old man. The shame was burning him alive. He had mocked the hands that had saved lives. He had laughed at the tremors that were the cost of survival. The old man saw him staring. He didn't gloat. He didn't sneer. He just walked over to Miller, his gait slow and shuffling. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of brass, the casings from Miller's missed shots that he had picked up earlier. He held them out, his hand shaking, the brass jingling like chimes. "Here," the old man said softly. "Keep these reminders." Miller took the brass, his own hands trembling now. "Reminders of what?" Miller whispered. The old man looked him in the eye, and for a moment the steel-gray eyes weren't tired. They were fierce. "That the wind always speaks," the old man said, "and that the loudest thing on the battlefield is usually the first thing to die." With that, the old man turned and walked toward the general's SUV, leaving Miller standing in the dust, holding the empty casings of his own arrogance. The shift was complete. The janitor was gone. The ghost had returned. As General Sterling opened the car door for the old man, an act of deference that violated every protocol in the book, the snipers realized that the lesson they had just learned wasn't about shooting. It was about the terrifying, quiet power of the men who had paved the road they were walking on. But the story wasn't over. The general wasn't taking him to lunch. He was taking him to the war room, because there was a reason Sterling had come to the range today, a reason that went beyond inspection. There was a crisis brewing halfway across the world, a hostage situation in a terrain that looked exactly like the valley the old man had just mastered. And the general didn't need a computer. He needed a ghost. The journey from the sweltering, dust-choked firing range to the hermetically sealed, frost-cold atmosphere of the base command center was a blur of flashing lights and high-speed driving that left Corporal Miller feeling as though his stomach had been left somewhere back at the 1,000-yard line, suspended in the same heat haze that had swallowed his pride. He sat in the back of the second SUV, sandwiched between two stern-faced military police officers who looked at him not as a fellow soldier, but as a piece of evidence in a crime they didn't yet understand. While in the lead vehicle, the general's personal up-armored Chevrolet Suburban, the janitor sat in the VIP seat, a proximity to power that was technically illegal for a civilian contractor without a clearance badge. Yet no one, absolutely no one, had dared to challenge Lieutenant General Sterling when he opened the door for the old man. The convoy tore through the base, bypassing security checkpoints with a blare of sirens that sent gate guards scrambling to snap salutes, and as they approached the massive, windowless concrete bunker that housed the Tactical Operations Center, the TOC, Miller felt a cold bead of sweat trickle down his spine, realizing that he was being dragged into the heart of the beast, into the room where wars were directed, all because he had mocked a man who cleaned toilets for a living. The vehicles screeched to a halt in the underground loading bay, the tires echoing against the reinforced concrete walls, and before the engines had even died, the general's security detail was moving, opening doors with practiced precision. Miller scrambled out, his legs feeling like jelly, and watched as the old man emerged from the lead vehicle. The contrast was jarring, almost comical if it weren't so terrifying. Amidst the sea of pressed uniforms, body armor, and high-tech weaponry, the old man stood in his faded red work shirt, stained with gun oil and sweat, his worn blue jeans baggy around his thin frame, and his scuffed brown boots looking like they belonged in a garden, not a war room. He looked small, frail, his head bowed slightly as if the weight of the sudden attention was heavier than the rifle he had just fired, and his hands, those infamous, trembling hands, were tucked deep into his pockets, hiding the tremors that had just put 5 rounds through the same jagged hole at nearly a mile. General Sterling didn't wait. He moved with the momentum of a freight train, his stride long and purposeful, gesturing for the old man to walk beside him, not behind him, while barking orders at his aides to bring the range personnel, meaning Miller and Master Sergeant Vance, along as witnesses. They entered the facility, passing through layers of biometric scanners and armed sentries who did double takes at the sight of the disheveled geriatric walking point with the Corps commander, their eyes widening as they saw the general place a hand on the old man's back to guide him through the blast doors. Inside the TOC, the atmosphere was a physical wall of tension, a buzzing hive of activity where dozens of officers, analysts, and communication specialists hunched over banks of glowing monitors, the room bathed in the cool blue light of the massive situational awareness screens that covered the front wall. This was the brain of the military machine, a place where clearance levels were currency and silence was golden. And as the heavy doors hissed shut behind them, the hum of conversation died instantly. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. The sight of General Sterling brought the room to a snap-attention halt, chairs scraping back, spines stiffening, but the eyes didn't stay on the general. They drifted, confused and judgmental, to the old man standing beside him. A colonel with a headset around his neck and a look of extreme stress etched into his features, Colonel Strickland, the chief of operations, stepped forward from the central dais, his face flushing with irritation as he saw the unauthorized civilian. General Sterling, Strickland said, his voice clipped and urgent, ignoring the salute in his haste. Sir, we have a situation red in the Kunduz sector. Team 6 is pinned. We are taking casualties. I don't have time for a facility tour. He glared at the old man, his eyes raking over the dirty clothes, the messy hair, the sheer unbelongingness of him. And sir, this is a SCIF. That man has no clearance. He needs to be escorted out immediately. We are handling classified real-time feeds. It was the same dismissal Miller had used on the range, the same arrogance of rank and protocol. And Miller, standing in the shadows near the door, felt a phantom pang of sympathy for the colonel, knowing exactly what kind of buzzsaw he was walking into. General Sterling didn't stop walking. He marched straight up to the central command table, a massive digital surface displaying a 3D topographic map of a mountainous region halfway across the world, and slammed his hand down on the metal rim. "Colonel," Sterling said, his voice low and dangerous, echoing through the silent room. "You are correct. You don't have time, which is why I brought him." Strickland blinked, confused. "Brought who, sir?" "The janitor." A ripple of incredulous murmurs went through the room. "A janitor in the TOC during a live extraction crisis?" "This," Sterling announced, his voice rising to fill the cavernous space, "is not a janitor. And as for his clearance—" "Colonel, pull up file designation, Sierra 01 Ghost." The room went deadly silent. The term Sierra 0 was a myth, a designation for files that were buried so deep in the black budget that they technically didn't exist. Strickland hesitated, his hand hovering over the console. "Sir, that requires a dual-key override. That's a decommissioned ultra-black archive. I can't just—" "Do it, Colonel!" Sterling roared, the sound shattering the composure of every officer in the room. "Override authorization Sterling Alpha 9. Execute." Strickland, pale and shaking slightly, typed in the commands. The massive main screen on the wall flickered, the live drone feed of the ambush in Kunduz shrinking to a picture-in-picture window, replaced by a spinning loading icon that looked archaic, a digital relic from a Cold War database. Then the file opened. A black and white photograph filled the screen, a young man, lean and wolf-like, holding a rifle that looked like a cannon, standing amidst the ruins of a jungle temple. The eyes in the photo were unmistakable. Steel gray, predatory, the same eyes that were currently looking down at the floor in the center of the room. Text began to scroll rapidly beside the photo. Name: Graves Thomas J. /rank, Master Gunnery Sergeant Ret, CALLSIGN, Wraith /status, presumed KIA 1978, specialization, extreme long-range ballistics, counter-sniper operations, ghost reconnaissance. The room gasped collectively. The sheer number of redacted black bars on the document was staggering, covering entire years of operation, but the unredacted parts were enough to stop hearts. Confirmed KILLS, redacted, longest confirmed elimination, 2,400 meters iron sights, decorations, Navy Cross 3X, Silver Star 4X, Purple Heart 9X. Corporal Miller felt his knees give way, and he had to lean against the wall to keep from sliding to the floor. He had told a man with 3 Navy Crosses to go clean the latrines. He had mocked the hands that had earned 9 Purple Hearts. The nausea was back, violent and overwhelming. Colonel Strickland stared at the screen, then at the old man, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Wraith," Strickland whispered. "The Wraith is a training parable. It's a story we tell snipers to make them check their six. He's not real." General Sterling turned to the old man, who was now standing uncomfortably under the glow of his own legend. "He's real, Colonel, and he's been sweeping your floors for 5 years because he wanted peace. But today we don't have peace, we have a problem." Sterling pointed to the live feed in the corner of the screen. "Brief him." Strickland shook his head, trying to reboot his brain. "Sir, Team 6 is pinned down in a valley in Kunduz. They're taking fire from a high-angle sniper position. We can't see the shooter. Thermal is washed out by the rock heat. Drones are blind. We've lost 2 men. If we try to move the exfil chopper in, the sniper will take out the rotor. We are stuck. We need to neutralize that shooter, but we can't find him." The old man, Graves, finally looked up. The tremors in his hands were visible to everyone now, the shaking violent and constant, but his eyes were fixed on the 3D map table. He stepped forward, shuffling in his worn boots, and the sea of officers parted for him as if he were radioactive. He didn't look at the classified data streams, he looked at the terrain geometry, he looked at the wind vectors, he looked at the shadows. "Zoom in," Graves rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "Sector 4, the ridge line." Strickland hesitated, then obeyed. The map zoomed in. "There's nothing there," Strickland said, his tone still skeptical but wavering. "Scanned it with multispectral. It's cold rock." "It's not cold," Graves whispered, his shaking finger hovering over a jagged crevice on the map. "It's a vent, a thermal vent from the cave system. He's shooting through the heat shimmering off the vent. It masks his thermal signature, and the wind." Graves closed his eyes, his head bobbing with the tremors. The wind in that valley, at this time of day, it curls up the face. He's not holding over, he's holding under. He's shooting into the updraft. The room was silent, watching a janitor dissect a battlefield thousands of miles away as if he were standing there. "How do you know that?" a major asked, skepticism creeping back in. "The computer says the wind is static." Graves opened his eyes and looked at the major with a pity that was worse than anger. "The computer doesn't know the smell of that valley," Graves said softly. "I spent 3 weeks on that ridge in '75. The wind cheats, and so does the enemy." He turned to Sterling. "You have a counter-sniper team in the valley. We have a marksman with a .50 cal, Strickland answered, "but he can't see the target." "He doesn't need to see him," Graves said. "He needs to shoot the rock." "Shoot the rock," Strickland exploded. "We are not wasting ammo shooting rocks while our men are bleeding out. This is insane, General. He's senile." Graves ignored the outburst. He looked at the map again, his hand shaking so hard he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. "The shooter is tucked behind the shale shelf. He's invisible from the front, but if you put a round into the overhang above him, the shale is unstable, it's sedimentary. You hit the stress point." He pointed a trembling finger at a specific protrusion of rock on the map. "Right there, the face collapses, you bury him." The audacity of the plan was staggering. It wasn't a shot to kill, it was a shot to terraform. It was a shot that required an understanding of geology, ballistics, and the enemy's psychology that no algorithm possessed. Strickland looked at General Sterling. "Sir, this is a gamble. If he misses or if the rock doesn't break, we give away the sniper's position and he dies." Sterling looked at Graves. He looked at the shaking hands. He remembered the shots on the range, the dead man's drift. "Do it," Sterling ordered. "Relay the coordinates to the team. Target the overhang." "Sir," Strickland protested. "This is a civilian giving firing orders." "I am giving the order," Sterling barked. "Send it." The comms officer, terrified, relayed the instructions. "Team 6, actual fire mission, target reference point Bravo Zulu, the rock overhang at elevation 4,000, 1 round, high explosive." The audio from the battlefield crackled over the speakers, sounds of gunfire, shouting, the chaotic noise of combat. Then the sniper's voice, "Command, say again." "You want me to shoot the mountain?" "Execute," Sterling said into the mic. The room held its breath. On the screen, the drone feed showed the valley. A tiny puff of smoke appeared on the ridgeline as the .50 cal fired. For a second, nothing happened. Strickland opened his mouth to speak, to condemn the failure, to prove that the old man was just a crazy relic. Then the mountain moved. The overhang above the suspected sniper position shuddered. A crack appeared, visible even from the drone's altitude. And then thousands of tons of shale and rock sheared off the face of the cliff, cascading down in a thunderous landslide that swallowed the specific crevice Graves had pointed to. The dust cloud was massive. As it settled, the enemy fire, which had been relentless for 3 hours, stopped. Dead silence. Then the radio crackled. "Target neutralized. I repeat, target neutralized. The shooter is buried. We are moving. We are moving." Cheers didn't erupt. The room was too shocked for that. Instead, a heavy, reverent silence descended, heavier than the one on the firing range. The officers stared at the screen, then at the map, then at the old man. He had just killed an enemy sniper from 7,000 miles away, using a memory of the wind and a knowledge of rocks. Strickland looked at Graves, his face drained of color. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a terrifying realization of his own inadequacy. You knew the shale was unstable." Graves shrugged, pulling his hands back into his pockets to hide the shaking. "Everything breaks if you hit it right," he murmured. "Even mountains." He turned to leave, looking tired, looking like he just wanted to go back to his broom and his anonymity. "I'm gonna go now, Jimmy," he said to the general. "My shift ends at 4. But he didn't make it to the door. General Sterling didn't move, but he spoke one word. "Attention!" It wasn't a shout. It was a statement of fact. And this time, it wasn't just the students. It wasn't just Miller. It was everyone. The colonel, the majors, the analysts, the MPs, the entire tactical operations center of the joint base. The sound of 100 chairs pushing back, 100 pairs of boots snapping together, filled the room. General Sterling turned to face the old man. He stood rigid, his spine steel, his face glowing with a pride that burned brighter than the monitors. He raised his hand in a slow, perfect salute. A salute to a man in a dirty red shirt. A salute to the ghost. Colonel Strickland, swallowing his shame, raised his hand. The comms officers raised theirs. Even the MPs at the door snapped to present arms. And in the back, Corporal Miller, tears streaming down his face, saluted with a trembling hand of his own, finally understanding what true strength looked like. It didn't look like steady hand. It looked like carrying the weight of the world and never asking for help to lift it. The old man stopped. He looked around the room, at the sea of uniforms honoring him, at the faces of men and women who now knew that their safety was built on the broken back of his sacrifice. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just straightened up, fighting the curve of his spine, fighting the tremors, fighting the pain of 1,000 old wounds. He pulled his hands out of his pockets. He let them see the shake. And then, with a dignity that shamed the stars on their collars, he returned the salute. It was slow, it was shaky, but it was the most perfect thing Miller had ever seen. The reveal was complete. The ghost was no longer a myth. He was the man standing in the center of the room, and for the first time in 40 years he was seen. But as the hands lowered, the general's voice cut through the emotion, shifting from reverence back to war. "You're not going anywhere, Gunny," Sterling said softly. "The file is open, and I have 3 more hot zones that need your eyes." The old man looked at the door, then back at the map. He sighed, the sound of a man accepting a burden he thought he had laid down. He walked back to the table, his boots shuffling on the polished floor. "All right," Graves whispered, leaning over the map as his hands danced their rhythmic, trembling dance over the world. "Show me the next one, and someone get me a cup of coffee, black, and tell the kid." He pointed a shaking finger at Miller in the back of the room without looking at him. "Tell the kid to stop crying. It ruins his sight picture." Miller straightened up, wiping his face, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't crying from sadness. He was crying because he had just watched a god walk among them, and he had been lucky enough to be forgiven by him. The climax had passed, but the lesson was just beginning. The janitor was gone. The teacher had arrived. And the war room, for the first time that day, felt safe. The operational tempo inside the Tactical Operations Center did not slow down after the revelation of the ghost's identity. Rather, it shifted into a gear that none of the younger officers had ever experienced, a mode of warfare that was less about digital throughput and more about an instinctive, almost preternatural connection to the battlefield that Master Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Graves, the man they had known as the janitor, brought into the room like a cold draft from an open grave. For the next 4 hours, the high-tech sanctuary of the Joint Base Command became a classroom, and the old man in the dirty red shirt was the reluctant professor, moving from station to station with his shuffling, pained gait, his trembling hands hovering over maps and screens as he dismantled complex tactical problems with the blunt simplicity of a hammer striking glass. He didn't use military jargon. He didn't talk about force multipliers or asymmetric vectors. He talked about the way sound carries over water at dawn, the way fear smells in a confined space, the way a man walks when he is walking into a trap versus when he is walking home. And every time he spoke, the room, populated by men and women with advanced degrees in strategic studies, fell into a hushed, reverent silence to catch the raspy, gravel-filled timbre of his voice. He guided a convoy out of a kill box in the Horn of Africa, not by rerouting them through a secure sector, but by telling them to turn off their headlights and drive directly through a sandstorm that the satellites said was impassable, because he knew that the local militia wouldn't have optics that could penetrate the silica, effectively making the convoy invisible. He corrected a drone pilot's approach vector on a high-value target in a dense urban center, not by calculating the fuel load, but by pointing out that the shadows in the courtyard indicated laundry day, meaning civilians would be on the roofs and the strike had to be delayed or aborted. He was right, every single time. The shaking hands that Corporal Miller had mocked only hours ago were now the instruments of salvation, tracing lines of survival across the globe. And as Miller watched from the back of the room, his face still streaked with the dried salt of his earlier tears, he felt a profound, tectonic shifting in his soul, a dismantling of the ego that had been built up by years of being told he was elite, simply because he passed a selection course. He realized, with a clarity that hurt his chest, that he was not a warrior, he was a technician. This old man, this wraith, was a warrior. The difference was not in the equipment, it was in the blood. As the sun began to dip below the horizon outside the bunker, painting the sky in the bruised purples and bloody oranges of twilight, the immediate crises on the board were resolved, the hot zones cooling down into stable patterns of green lights on the status board. The adrenaline that had sustained Graves began to ebb, and the cost of the energy expenditure became visibly apparent. The tremors in his hands worsened, becoming violent spasms that rattled the ceramic mug of black coffee General Sterling had personally placed in front of him. Graves slumped into a chair, not a command chair, but a folding metal chair someone had dragged over, and wiped a hand across his face, smearing the grease and grime into the deep wrinkles of his forehead. The room, sensing the shift, slowly exhaled. The frenetic energy dissipated, replaced by a heavy emotional gravity. General Sterling dismissed the non-essential personnel, clearing the room of everyone except the core command staff, his personal security detail, and at a specific gesture from the General, Corporal Miller, and Master Sergeant Vance. The silence that followed was thick, filled only by the hum of the cooling servers and the rhythmic clink-clink-clink of the coffee cup vibrating against the table as Graves held it with both hands, trying to steady it enough to take a sip. It was a painful sight, a stark reminder of the frailty that housed the brilliance, and Miller felt a fresh wave of shame wash over him. He wanted to look away, to spare the old man the indignity of being watched in his weakness, but he couldn't. He owed it to him to witness the cost. General Sterling leaned against the command table, crossing his arms, looking at his old friend with a mixture of love and sorrow. "You're burning hot, Tommy," Sterling said softly, using the nickname that no one else dared to use. "You pushed it too hard today. You need a medic." Graves shook his head, finally managing to bring the cup to his lips and taking a small, scalding sip. "I don't need a medic, Jimmy," he rasped. "I need a cigarette. And I need to go home. My dog hasn't been fed." The mundane nature of the request, the dog, the home, the cigarette, was jarring against the backdrop of the global violence he had just orchestrated. It grounded him, reminded them that the ghost was also a man who lived in a trailer off base and bought generic dog food. "We can take care of the dog," Sterling said. "We can take care of everything. You know the offer is still on the table. Reinstatement, consultant status, a warm office. No more brooms, no more trash cans. You've done your penance if that's what this was." Graves set the cup down, the liquid splashing slightly over the rim. He looked up at the general, his steel gray eyes tired but lucid. "It wasn't penance," he said quietly. "It was grounding." He looked at his hands, watching them shake. "You think I clean the range because I need the money? I have a pension I haven't touched in 20 years. I clean the range because I need to hear the shots. I need to smell the powder. But I don't want to be the one pulling the trigger anymore. I want it to be nearby, just in case." He gestured vaguely to the room, to the screens, to the world. "In case the wind changed." He paused, his gaze drifting to the back of the room where Miller stood, rigid and pale. "Come here, son," Graves said. The order was soft, but it pulled Miller across the room as if he were on a wire. Miller walked forward, his boots feeling heavy, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stopped 3 feet from the old man and snapped to the position of attention, his posture perfect, his eyes locked on the wall above Graves' head. "Corporal Miller reporting as ordered, sir," Miller shouted, his voice cracking slightly. Graves sighed, a long, weary sound. "At ease, son, cut the parade deck crap, look at me." Miller hesitated, then slowly lowered his gaze. He looked into the face of the man he had bullied, the man he had called Grandpa, the man he had threatened to kick off the line. He saw the scars, he saw the sun damage, he saw the kindness that shouldn't have been there. I don't have the words, sir," Miller whispered, his voice trembling. I am so sorry. I didn't know. I was arrogant. I was stupid. I deserve a court-martial." Graves chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "You don't deserve a court-martial. You deserve a haircut, maybe. Your fade is terrible." The joke broke the tension slightly, but Graves' face quickly turned serious again. He reached out and grabbed Miller's hand, the young, steady hand of the sniper, with his own shaking, gnarled grip. The contrast was visceral. The vibration of the old man's hand traveled up Miller's arm, a physical frequency of trauma. "You asked me on the range why I was shaking," Graves said, his voice dropping to a whisper that drew the general and the colonels in closer. "You laughed at it. You thought it was weakness." Miller nodded, tears spilling over again. "Yes, sir, I did." "It's not weakness," Graves said, tightening his grip, his hand vibrating with a strength that belied the tremor. "And it's not just nerves, it's the recoil, not the recoil of the rifle, the recoil of the life." He let go of Miller's hand and held his own up to the light, studying it as if it belonged to someone else. "Every time you take a shot, Corporal, you take something from the world that you can't put back. You change the timeline, you end a story, and the energy of that, it doesn't just disappear. It goes into the stock, it goes into your shoulder, it goes into your blood." He looked Miller dead in the eye. "My hands shake because they are holding onto the ghosts of 300 men who didn't make it home. They shake because for 40 years I haven't been able to put the rifle down, even when I'm holding a broom. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget." The room was so silent you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Miller stared at the old man, his worldview shattering and reassembling in a new, profound configuration. He realized that the shaking wasn't a defect, it was a receipt, it was the bill of sale for the freedom Miller enjoyed. "You want to be a sniper?" Graves asked, his voice hardening. "You want to be elite? Then you have to accept that one day your hands will shake too, and if they don't, it means you didn't care enough. It means you were just a killer, not a guardian. And there is a hell of a difference." Miller nodded, the lesson sinking into the marrow of his bones. "I understand, sir. I think I understand." Graves nodded, satisfied. He stood up, groaning as his knees protested, and grabbed his faded cap from the table. Good, now stop apologizing. Guilt is a heavy rock. Drop it. You learned. That's the job. He turned to General Sterling. I'm done, Jimmy. I'm tired. Sterling stepped forward, placing a hand on Graves' shoulder. Tom, at least let me drive you. Let me get you a detail. Security. Graves shook his head. I drove myself here in my truck. I'll drive myself home. I don't need a detail. I'm the safest man in the city. He smirked, the old wolf peeking out. Besides, if anyone tries to mug me, I'll just shake 'em to death. Sterling laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh that cleared the last of the tension from the room. You stubborn old bastard. Fine, but expect a delivery of dog food, premium stuff, and, Tom. Graves paused at the door. Yeah, don't come in tomorrow, Sterling said seriously. Take the day, that's an order. Graves smiled, putting his cap back on, the faded patch catching the light. Can't do that, General. Tomorrow is brass pickup day. If I don't do it, these kids will leave the range a mess. He glanced back at Miller. Right, Corporal. Miller snapped to attention again, but this time his salute was sharp, crisp, and filled with a reverence that came from the soul. We'll pick up the brass, sir. You won't have to bend down for a single casing. I promise. Graves looked at him, and for the first time the janitor looked like the Wraith, proud, lethal, and content. We'll see, Graves said. And with that, he walked out of the Tactical Operations Center, the blast doors hissing shut behind him, leaving a room full of the most powerful men in the military staring at the empty space where a legend had stood. The drive home was quiet. Graves drove his rusted 1998 Ford F-150 through the base gates, the guards waving him through with the casual indifference they usually showed the janitorial staff. Word hadn't spread to the perimeter yet. He liked it that way. He parked in front of his single-wide trailer, greeted his golden retriever, Buster, who thumped his tail happily, and sat on his porch as the night settled in. He lit a cigarette, his hand shaking as he brought the flame to the tip and watched the smoke drift up toward the stars. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like a legend. He just felt old. But for the first time in a long time, the shaking didn't bother him. He looked at his hand, vibrating against the armrest of his lawn chair, and he didn't try to stop it. He let it shake. He let it carry the current. He thought about Miller. He thought about the look in the kid's eyes, the transition from arrogance to humility. That was the real victory, not the shot on the range, not the strike in Kunduz, but the saving of a soul. He had stopped a young man from becoming a machine and reminded him that he was a human being. That was a good day's work. He finished his cigarette, crushed it out, and went inside to feed the dog. The next morning, the sun rose over the long-range sniper course with the same blistering intensity as the day before, baking the gravel and shimmering off the steel targets. Graves arrived at 600, just as he always did, parking his truck behind the shed and pulling out his push broom and his canvas sack. He walked toward the firing line, expecting to see the usual debris, the scattered brass, the trash, the chaotic remnants of training. But as he rounded the corner of the tower, he stopped. He stopped and he stared. The firing line was immaculate, not a single piece of brass on the concrete. The trash barrels were emptied and relined. The shooting mats were aligned with geometric perfection, and standing there in formation, silent and motionless, was the entire sniper class. 24 young men standing in 2 rows. Corporal Miller stood at the front, centered. They weren't in their casual range gear. They were in full battle rattle, but their rifles were grounded, placed neatly on the racks behind them. As Graves stepped onto the concrete, Miller barked a command that echoed off the valley walls. Platoon! ATTNTON! The snap of heels was a thunderclap. 24 backs straightened, 24 chins lifted. Graves stood there, holding his broom, his red work shirt flapping slightly in the morning breeze. He looked at Miller. Miller looked back, his eyes clear, respectful, and awake. Range is prepped for inspection, sir, Miller shouted. Brass is policing. Targets are painted. Wind flags are calibrated. Graves looked at the line. He looked at the spotless concrete. He felt a lump form in his throat, a rare intrusion of emotion that he quickly swallowed. He walked slowly toward Miller, his boots scuffing the ground. He stopped in front of the young corporal. You missed a spot, Graves said, deadpan. Miller blinked, panic flashing in his eyes for a second before he saw the twinkle in the old man's eye. Sir, just kidding, son, Graves whispered. It looks good. He turned to address the platoon. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. You boys think because you cleaned up you get a day off. Silence. Grab your gear, Graves said, his voice gaining strength. The wind is coming out of the east today. It's a tricky drift, and I'm not going to be here forever to call it for you. He walked past them toward the tower, but instead of going to the janitor's closet, he walked up the stairs to the instructor's platform. Master Sergeant Vance was there, waiting. Vance stepped aside, offering the spotting scope to the old man. Graves leaned against the railing, looking out over the valley, his valley. He watched the hawk circling. He watched the grass ripple. He looked down at his hands. They were still shaking. They would always shake. But as he looked back at the young men scrambling to their rifles, eager to learn, eager to listen, he realized that the shaking wasn't just a receipt for the past. It was a frequency, a signal, and finally, after all these years, someone had tuned in. "Corporal Miller," Graves called out from the tower, his voice amplified by the PA system for the first time. "Take position 1, load and make ready." Miller dropped to the mat, his movement fluid, humble. "Ready, sir." "Target is the cold bore plate at 1,400, Graves said. "Wind is full value left. But watch the hawk, Miller, watch the hawk." "Watching the hawk, sir," Miller replied. Graves smiled, a small, private smile that smoothed out the years of pain on his face. He wasn't the janitor anymore. He wasn't even the wraith. He was just the old man on the range, and that was enough. "Send it," Graves whispered. And as the rifle cracked, echoing through the valley, the old man didn't flinch. He just listened to the song of the bullet, a song he had written, and a song he was now teaching them to sing.